Okay, very good. So, yes, very great honor to be here in this hall, give a talk today, and with permission of the Venerable Sangha. And very wonderful to be back here in Colombo. And a special hello to all of those folks who are joining us online. And so may you also be happy wherever you are. I don't know where you're coming from, but wherever that you are, I hope you're happy. I, I just have to say, I am getting flashbacks to when I was a child and I used to go to church every weekend and we had to sit on the pews. So, yeah. Okay, so the talk for this evening is on the four elements. Now, I'm assuming that you are all educated people and you know what the four elements are. Is that correct? First, okay, I'm going to do a test. First of all, first question, number one, how many of them are there? Anybody? Four? Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. That's excellent. Okay, very good. And what are they? Yep. Okay, earth, water, fire, heat. Okay, very good. Hang on, earth, water, fire, heat. No, that's not right. That's air, air. Okay, earth, water, fire, air. Good. I would have been off to a rocky start. But anyway, okay, very good. So four elements. Now, obviously, so I'm going to give a bit of a talk this evening about the four elements, and I'm going to offer some reflections on some different dimensions of these elements. I was going to say elephants. And hopefully find new ways of reflecting or looking at or understanding these things. Actually, the last about 2 years ago, I did a series of talks in Australia with the CSIROs, Australia's scientific body, where Jayanta used to work. Anyway, Jayanta's works anyway. And they wanted to hear some teachings on these four elements. So I actually did a series where we were meditating and contemplating on these four elements. So the four elements obviously depict in some way the Buddha's analysis or way of seeing the material world. And we, in Buddhism, we focus mainly on psychology. We focus mainly on like what happens inside our mind. But the Buddha, obviously, we do live in a material world, and the Buddha did have some things to say about that. So very briefly, when we talk about earth, water, fire, and air, we're obviously not just talking about the literal manifestations of those things, but we're talking about the physical properties that they represent. And so often we might often translate them as solidity is air, liquidity is water, heat is fire, and gaseousness, I guess, is air. Sometimes also defined as movement. So, but just very briefly, if we consider them from a physical point of view, just purely from a physical point of view, you can see this is actually very similar to the way that classical Western physics thinks about matter, right? Solidity is obviously the solid, liquid, and gas, which are the three main states of matter that we learned about at high school. And then the element of fire is the element of change, right? So fire changes things from solid to liquid, liquid to gas, and then back again. You add more heat, and then they transmute and they come back again. So fire is always said to be the element of aging in Buddhism. But interesting, though, in modern science, that fire itself is actually kind of, in a way, kind of an element as well. So, which is these days they're called plasma. Actually, I didn't learn about plasma when I was in high school, but luckily we had a physicist who was just done her PhD on plasma, and she told me about it. And so now I know that plasma is actually the Tejo Dhatu, like the literal form of the Tejo Dhatu is plasma. So So that's actually maps onto the physical world or the scientific world quite well. And even like details like in the air element is always said to be associated with movement in particular. But we know that that's, obviously there's movement in terms of the wind and so on. But even on a molecular level, the difference between a liquid and a gas is essentially that a gas is moving faster. The molecules are moving faster. And so that aspect of movement is still very closely tied to that state of matter. So we can think of these things as being the four primary states of matter. So often in Pali called the dhatu, but also often called the mahabhuta, right? Mahabhuta. And in my translation, like often when we translate these into English, we often translate them as elements, which is like elements is like the classical way that these have been talked about in English, even though they're not exactly chemical elements as in the periodic table, but they usually be called elements. So normally dhatu and mahabhuta have often both been translated as elements. But these days I translate mahabhuta as being the states of matter. So the mahabhuta are the states in which matter occurs. So that's the physical side of things. And already from that physical side of things, you can see a few things that are kind of interesting. Just to give you a few examples. So the states of matter, these kinds of ideas of these elements are quite well known. Like you get them right across the world in many different forms. But usually the forms are kind of slightly different. So for example, the Chinese they add the element of wood to this, right? So you have the element of wood as well. And you can understand why they do that because that includes organic matter, right? But it's kind of interesting that from a physical perspective, wood is just ordinary matter. It's just complex physical compounds and so on. And so the Buddha didn't have a separate category for wood or for organic matter. And that's also, of course, the position of modern science, right? That there's no separate category, if you like, of organic matter. So it's kind of interesting, I find, that even though on one hand, this understanding of the elements is very widespread, but on the other hand, specifically the Buddhist analysis of these elements, I think, stands the test of time quite well and still is meaningful in our present day. All right, so that's one thing. Second thing is that even though these elements are basically map onto the Western concepts of, or the modern physical concepts of solid, liquid, gas, and plasma, but they're actually subtly different. Like they correspond to them quite precisely, but they're looking at the same thing from a different perspective. And this is really crucial to understand the elements in Buddhism. A scientist looks at elements from the outside. So we look at them as an observer. We use our sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, and we use scientific instruments and so on and so forth, and we can observe it as an objective reality, right? So a scientist will get, like sometimes literally, some earth, and then we'll break it down, assay it, look at the different parts of it, and so on. And so you can physically analyze what that is. And that's one of the things that science does to try to understand better the material world that we're surrounded by. And then, of course, that can be useful for a lot of things like agriculture or mining and so on and so forth. From a Buddhist point of view, we look at the same thing from the inside. So we're not looking at an objective reality out there. We're looking at how we experience the reality. Right? So the experience of the four elements is an experience. And in our meditation, we know what it's like to feel that hardness. We know what it's like to feel that liquid. We know what it's like to feel that movement or that gas. And we know what it's like to feel that, that sense of heat or lack of heat. So these concepts are on the one hand very similar or basically the same as the modern physical concepts of states of matter, and on the other hand they are almost completely different, actually. It's a completely different kind of thing, or rather, not necessarily a completely different kind of thing, but a completely different way of seeing the world. So you're not going to, and in some ways, obviously, this is not, for some things, it's not as useful. If I want to understand the properties of a metal, for example, then that's very useful for making cars or building bridges or all of those things. I can't do the same thing in meditation and then come up with some new alloy or something like that. We can only do that by experimenting in a laboratory and by testing the external properties of matter. In meditation, we're doing a quite different program. And even though we're looking at the same world, we're looking at it from a different lens and to a different purpose. Right? So these two very different perspectives. Personally, I believe that these perspectives have much to learn from each other. And I think that there is a problem with the Western or the modern scientific way of doing things, because we end up divorcing ourselves from that thing that we're studying, the separation of the observer and the observed. And when you do that, then this is what makes science possible as we understand it today. But it also makes it possible for us to exist separately from nature, right? Nature becomes something out there on which we operate and which we can transform, and we can bend to our will. And I believe that this is at the root of many of the problems that we're facing today, that we have put too much effort into treating nature as something out there to bend to our will, and we've got very good at doing that, and not nearly enough effort into understanding the fact that we are part of that, and that our experience of that physical world is the reality that in which we live. Now, one of the lenses that I always use for understanding the Dhamma is I look at the Dhamma through a lens that I call dialectical. And what I mean by dialectical, it's very simple. I mean, it's part of a conversation. So when we are talking, we discuss Dhamma, and we will, after this, we'll have some questions and be back and forth, and we'll have some discussions about Dhamma. And the Buddha did exactly the same thing. In the suttas are in fact records of conversations. And it's interesting, if you take a step back and look at the suttas, you see that the Buddha obviously spoke with the Sangha a lot, but typically, interestingly enough, almost all the time, like 99% of the time, don't quote me on that figure, I just made it up, but 99% of the time he gives a short discourse. Right? This is impermanent forms, impermanent, so on, so it's impermanent, and that's it. Straightforward teaching. So he was always advising and encouraging the Sangha with these straightforward teachings that would get them to contemplate and reflect. Most of the time, when there are longer discourses, more complex ones, it's part of a conversation. Not absolutely every time, but most of the time. And often those conversations are not with the Sangha, and not even with other Buddhists, but with people who are not Buddhists. And this is one of the outstanding characteristics of the suttas. For example, if you look at the Digha Nikaya, the entire first chapter of the Digha Nikaya is basically conversations with people who are not Buddhists, or at least in some kind of relationship with that. And there are many other examples through there as well. So the Buddha was obviously, he lived in a time and place. That time and place was very different to our time and place, 2,500 years ago in India. And he was speaking to all different kinds of people. And when he used these kinds of teachings, then he was responding to the way that people understood those teachings. That's what I mean when I'm saying that these things are dialectical. So in some ways, the idioms that we find in the suttas are quite different from the idioms that we might think of things today. For example, one of the things when it was just coming now, they had a nice rain shower. And I know that you live in Colombo and you're probably like, oh, it's raining again. But if you're from Australia, rain is so nice. And when you experience that rain, you're like, oh, that's that smell of it is so nice. This coolness in the air is so nice. So in Pali, the idiom is Deva Vasati, right? Literally, the god reigns. Yeah. And that is a Vedic idiom. It's literally uses the same idiom in the Rig Veda. And so there was this idea that the rain was being sent by the heavens, sent by some deity in the heavens who would bless us and bring that water down for us. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about rain, like casually, like if I'm not being a Buddhist, I'm just thinking about rain, I don't think about it in those terms. I think, oh, the rain is falling, the clouds are gathering, right? But I don't think, oh, there are gods in the sky sending rains down for me. I mean, look, maybe there are, okay? I haven't been up there, so I cannot confirm one way or another, okay? I'm just saying that's not how we think about it. But clearly, that's how people in the Buddha's day did think about it, right? So the Buddha was responding to people with those ideas, which are not necessarily the same as our ideas. And this brings up a very important point, which is that all of these four elements were gods, right? All of these four elements are gods. The earth, right, mother goddess, was the bearer of all, the source of fertility and abundance, Mahadharani. Water is many different deities of water, such as the great river Ganga or the great river Saraswati, and on it goes. Vayu is another very prominent god, the deity of the winds and the storms. Tejo is the great god Agni, of course, which is one of the main gods in the Rig Veda. So let's just stop and think for a minute about what that means. Right? Have a think about what it means to live in a world where you're surrounded by gods. And when the clouds rumble, right? This is the Maruts or the Indra sending his troops in, and then the rain comes down, and it's a blessing of God. And when you see a little seedling in the earth, right? Earth is just there, and then this little seedling come up, and you see, oh, this is a blessing of the goddess that she's given us this fruit. And so you're living in a world which is surrounded by gods. And this is very much the world of the pre-Buddhist era, of the world of the Rig Veda and the world of the people, the old Aryans. And their deities, their divinities were very much embodied in the nature that was around them. And so there was this sense of a connection with that nature. And so I want you to think carefully about this and about what this means. Because we live in a world where this is very much not the case. We have stripped all the gods away from nature. We don't think Earth is a god. We think Earth is just silicon and some trace elements and some decomposing organic matter, right? And if we want our Earth to be more productive, then we put some machine on it and we grind it up and we put some petrochemicals on it and we do all of those things. And we don't think of praying to a god or goddess to bring forth the earth. I'm not saying that we should go back and live like that, because you can't just make yourself live like that. It's a whole culture. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that there's something about it that connects you to the world around us in a way that's kind of uplifting and inspiring, right? It's kind of nice to imagine that you live in a world where everything is full of gods, right? Even if you don't believe, I'm not asking you to believe that yourself. I'm just saying it's kind of a nice thing. Some years ago, we did a retreat in Central Australia. And one of the things about that, which is really striking for me, was about how you are exposed to the elements in a very raw form. In fact, I taught the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta on that retreat, on the four elements, one of my favorite suttas. And as I would give the talk, then I would pick up a piece of the earth in my hands and hold it in my hands to remind myself of what this earth element is. And if you've been to the centre of Australia, then you know that there is a lot of earth element. A lot, yeah. Quite a bit of heat element too. Not so much water element. But one of the things I noticed about the earth element there is that the earth was not dirty. It's kind of strange. It's got to think about it for a minute. We think about earth as dirt, right? And as dirty. You get a little bit of dirt on your feet, and you walk into this hall with a beautifully clean floor, and you're going to mess up all the floor. You feel very embarrassed. Oh, I'm traipsing all this dirt here. And somehow we think that earth is dirt. But why should earth be dirt? It's literally the planet that we're living on is made of this stuff. And when you're in the desert and when you're in the wilds, earth is not dirty. Earth is just earth. Huh? And so when we lived on that, when we did our retreat there, we were only there for a few days, but when we did the retreat there, the local Aboriginal people, they're from the Pitjantjatjara tribe, and they told us some stories that they had about their land and so on. And one of them was very interesting. It was about a quoll, it's a small Australian marsupial, who stole some food from the nearby camp and then ran away, and people chased it. So first of all, it's kind of interesting because this is giving the origin of the second precept, right? To look after each other's stuff and don't steal stuff. And when we got to there was a cliff there, and there was a rock that would jut out from the cliff, and the Aboriginal man told us that this was where the quoll had looked back with a sense of shame. Yeah, very interesting, right? So that you're looking back with a sense of shame, how he realizes that what he did was wrong. Yeah, and then that is like literally embodied in the earth. There's a rock which is there that is teaching us this lesson about shame, teaching us this lesson that we cannot be stealing food from each other. You're living in the desert. Stealing food is very bad. People can die if they don't have that food. And so I learned something on that day about what it means to live in a world that is full of story, that is full of meaning. Yeah. To live in a world that is full of where the rocks and the stones and the water and the trees and the ground and the air and the sun all have some meaning. They're not just something which is there for us to use. I had a similar feeling for myself, a similar feeling when I was in India, especially in some places in India, especially in Bodh Gaya, and have that feeling that like everywhere you're going, that that there's something meaningful there. So I wonder what that means today for us, that we live in a time when our connection with nature is more broken than it ever has been, where we live lives that are so extraordinarily destructive to an extent that honestly, not a single one of us really understands. Even if you're like an environmental scientist or something like that, you don't really know because there's too much to actually know it. I mentioned before, I'd done this series of talks with the CSIRO and I got to know the scientists there quite well. one of the scientists, I asked, "Oh, has climate change affected your field of study?" And she just laughed and said, "What do you mean, has it affected?" She said, "My field of study doesn't exist anymore." She had studied the kelp forests, which are these huge seaweed forests in the ocean off the coast of Tasmania, and incredible ecosystems, really complex, so many different kinds of fish and everything like that living in these massive underwater forests of kelp. And she said they've all gone now because climate change changes the water currents, changes the temperatures, and it's just gone. But of course, you'd never see that. When you look on the ocean, it just looks like ocean. And we can't see what these changes are going on. Some of the climate scientists I know, when I ask them about, did you see this or did you see that in the news or that study or something? And then they say, I'm really sorry, I can't read the news. It's too traumatizing. This is where we are, and this is how far we've got, because we have seen ourselves so separated from nature. One of the things that I kind of noticed about science, I mentioned before about like in Western science, we have this idea that of science as being something that's very objective, where we are separate as the observer from that which we observe. It's the idea. Something that I've seen in actual people who are scientists is that their science very often comes from a place of love. And I've seen scientists who care so much about what they're doing. I saw a documentary one time of a lady who was doing research on seabirds in the Pacific who had been swallowing plastic. And so terrible. They had like, they're on some island in the middle of the Pacific, and it's what, so far away from everything, and they'd swallowed all of this plastic. You could see that their bellies were full of this plastic. And then she was studying them and wanting to know like how many there were, how they're affected and so on. But part of the studies, she would retrieve the plastic from their bellies. Like one by one, she would take these birds and then very, very carefully pull the pieces of plastic out from their gullet. Yeah. And you could see how much love that she put into that with every moment that she was caring for these poor animals, knowing, she was pulling like 10 or 20 coin-sized pieces of plastic out of the bellies of these small birds, and knowing that when they release them, they're just going to go and eat more. Yeah? And that's what I mean when I say that science in practice and by scientists is often driven by or inspired by love. So I don't think that separation is there in the science so much as the way that we maybe apply the science may be more of the problem. So this, I think, was one of the reasons why the CSIRO wanted to have these talks on the four elements, because because I think that a lot of the scientists have this intuitive feeling that we have this separation and it shouldn't be there. Like they want to find another way of seeing things. And so they're looking for a way of understanding that's going to help them to become more connected with that world. So this is where we come from a Buddhist point of view. So from a Buddhist point of view, we look at how we experience these elements inside ourselves. And when we meditate on those elements, okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about meditation on the four elements, but I'm just going to mention one basic principle first. The Buddha encourages us to meditate internally, externally, and then internally, externally. All right? Here, what's going on here, what's going on out there, and then internally, externally. We erase the boundary, because the earth element in here is just the same as the earth element out there. And we realize that we are part of that. So this is a fundamental principle in the four elements meditation. And so I would suggest that we can see this as a middle way between those two ways of seeing that I've talked about so far. the scientific way of looking at it, which is very reductive and materialist, which sees that the elements are something which are out there, which we can operate upon, or being independent of them as an observer. Right? That's one way of seeing. Or the other way of seeing is and that way of seeing has been very successful in terms of understanding the material world, in terms of increasing prosperity and all of those things. It's been incredibly successful, no doubt about that. And then there's the other way from the Vedic way of seeing it, which is where you see that the world is full of gods and that your relationship with that world is mediated through your relationship with the divine. I mean, that's a complex topic, but what it means is that if you want to farm some land, then yes, you should draw your plow, but you should also pray to the gods, right? So this is what that means. So these two ways of seeing it. And so I'm suggesting that the Buddha offers us a middle way, which maybe can give us the benefits of both of those ways. Right, so you have the benefit, the Vedic way of seeing gives us the sense of connection with nature, which is good. The scientific way of seeing gives us the ability to manipulate nature or understand the nature, which is good. And I think the Buddhist way can maybe give us both of those things. So from a Buddhist way of seeing it, we see that these elements inside ourselves are the same as those elements outside. Now, when it comes to the meditation on the four elements, oh my goodness, so much detail. So the Buddha taught that meditation very often in the suttas, very often. And of all the meditations in the suttas, it's the one that he taught in the most detail. More detail than Brahma Viharas, more detail than Anapanasati. So many different ways of looking at and contemplating these different elements. So and then if we look not just at suttas, but then we look at something like, say, the Visuddhimagga, then that gives us even more details again. And the section on the four elements meditation is by far the longest and most complex of the sections in the Visuddhimagga on meditation. So what that means is that there are many ways we can approach this practice. There is not one right way of doing it. There are many right ways of meditating on these four elements, but all of them have in common the idea that we want to become more aware, more clearly understanding of the nature of these properties as we experience them inside ourselves. This is the first foundation. Then that we can see those same properties externally, and then that we can dissolve the boundary between this property and that property. And from a Dhammic point of view, what that then leads to is a realization of not self, because we realize that this actually is just the four elements. What we are so attached to is just the four elements. So it leads us towards letting go, it leads us towards not self. But the four elements are not only taught in the context of not self. And I'm going to just run down very briefly on some of the meditative contexts in which the four elements appear in the suttas. So one context is the context of what we call the kasinas. Kasina is a Pali word which means universal or totality. And in this kasina meditation, one contemplates the earth element above, below, around, in all directions, advayam, non-dual, and kevalam, all-encompassing and total. And so this is a kind of jhana meditation or absorption meditation where you absorb into that experience of the earth, wind, or earth, water, fire, air. And then that becomes, for that period of time, that becomes the totality of your awareness. Now, when that happens, when you have that kind of meditation, then I just want to sort of stop a minute and just sort of say, well, how does that work? Like psychologically, how does that work? How do you go into deep meditation, into jhana, based on a piece of dirt? I mean, that seems a bit much, doesn't it, right? I mean, if you look at other religions will say, oh, you should contemplate God, and then you can have your meditation. Oh, that seems nice, right? because God is like all loving and so on. So you contemplate God. Okay, that seems good. And Buddhists come along and say, no, contemplate a patch of dirt. What? I'm sorry, why? Right? Okay. They're interesting, right? But then if you think about it, you realize that these elements actually do have that attractive quality to them. Right? Maybe you sit beside the ocean one day and just watch the waves coming in. It's nice. Or you go up in the hills and there's a lake and you sit beside the lake and you just look out there and say, oh, this is nice. Or I was going to say maybe there's a fire in the fireplace, but this is probably not very apt for Sri Lanka. Maybe you're in England and there's a fire in the fireplace and you're sitting beside it and you're going, oh, it's nice. And you can just sit and stare into the flames for such a long time. Yeah. And that same experience actually with earth element, you have very much in the Australian desert. The presence of the earth itself is very calming and settling, actually. Yeah? Or the air element as well. And there's certain places you can go to where the air is so overwhelming and so inspiring. So the elements by themselves, when we see the power that they hold in them, they have a capacity to bring our mind to peace, to inspire us, to draw us in. And so this is that idea. And so when we see it from that point of view, then it's not all that different from seeing the earth as having as being divine or having a presence of God in there. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's not completely different either, because we start to become one with this thing which is we perceive as being actually beautiful. Huh? Fire is beautiful. Water is beautiful. And this is how these can lead to these deep meditations. Right? So this is one pathway of developing the four elements meditation. And obviously I'm talking more on the samatha side here, right, of developing the meditation. And so you can do that. Again, there are many ways of doing that. You can use like a device, like a kasina device that we can make a disc or something like that to support that meditation. Or you can do it, it can be based on your experiences in nature and so on. So there are many different ways of doing that meditation. But one thing, just as a practical thing that I would suggest is that when you get the chance, just take the time to spend some time in nature and to just feel that sense of oneness and feel that sense of connection with things. Yeah? Sit beside a lake and just feel what that's like. Sit beside a river or at a mountain. And you feel like something, and that's some kind of sense of connection. And so this is where you're starting to intuit what the power of the four element meditation is. So this is one avenue, which itself is quite deep and quite complex. The other avenue, of course, is reflecting on them from the vipassana side of looking at it in terms of wisdom. And the Buddha, again, taught about this in many different ways. For example, he talked about the impermanence of the elements. Now, it's interesting that when we think about impermanence, if we meditate on impermanence, we usually see impermanence in terms of like the changes that we're observing in the mind and body in the present. And which, of course, the Buddha talked about often. But the Buddha also talked about impermanence in the very long term. And he talked about the fact that, for example, he would point to the mountains around Rajagaha and say, oh, it used to take, I can't remember the number it is, used to take so many days to walk up to that mountain. But now it only takes an afternoon to walk up that mountain. I just got to kind of stop there for a minute and think about that. I mean, how do you ever look at a mountain and realize, oh, this used to be a lot taller, right? That's not the kind of normal thing that people do when they see hills, right? The hills are just there. Mountains are just there. Who looks at a mountain and goes, oh, yeah, there was vast past ages, so many millions of years ago when that mountain was much taller. I mean, a geologist would, obviously, but the Buddha did as well. And he understood that change even happens to mountains. Yeah? And he said even these mighty Himalayas one day will be gone. He looked at the ocean. I mean, who looks at the ocean and then thinks, oh, one day that's going to evaporate? I mean, to all intents and purposes, the ocean is infinite. You're standing on the shores, you're looking out, it goes on forever. As deep as you want to go. How could that ever vanish? But the Buddha said, there'll come a time when there's only enough water to cover your ankle. Amazing, right? I find it amazing that the Buddha could think about these elements and realize that even this earth that we're on is impermanent. Everything that we see will be gone. The one time will come and this whole earth will burn up in fire. Who thinks like that? It's crazy, right? You can't just burn up the whole earth. There's not enough. There's not enough stuff to burn. We don't have enough stuff to burn the whole earth. It's impossible. It can't happen. Except, of course, we know that's exactly what will happen when the earth comes to an end. And literally, that's what will happen. This Buddha talks about this in the Sattasurya Sutta, the seven suns. So somehow the Buddha had this understanding of time and this understanding of impermanence and change, which saw with great clarity that all of these things that are around us are going to change. And so impermanence encompasses everything from that grand vista of time to the smallest event that's happening in our own mind in the present. All of that is impermanent. So when we contemplate the four elements from that analytical side, then we use more active reflection to be able to break down our experiences. Now, again, without going into it in too much detail, but basically what we do is that we begin by focusing on each of the elements in turn, because each of those elements has its own particular quality, its own particular property. And normally, in our experience, all of those things are kind of mixed up. So our experience is this kind of mess of all different kinds of stuff. So we start very slowly by trying to tease out one particular property. We say the earth element. And we start by contemplating something that has that quality of solidity inside ourselves, right? So we don't have time to really teach a meditation method today, but normally I teach people to start with your teeth, right? Your teeth are the hardest part of the earth element in your body, and you can feel them in your mouth. And from there, you can start to reflect on the earth element through your body. Now, my meditation teacher, Ajahn, when he was teaching the four elements meditation, he would always say, in Thai, he would always say, tang lu tang ru tang hen, which means both knowing and seeing. And what he meant by that was that when we're contemplating internally, we have these two modes of awareness, knowing and seeing. And by knowing, he meant the physical touch sensation, right? So we can actually feel the touch sensation of our teeth inside our mouth, right? Or if we're contemplating the water element, we can feel the saliva inside our mouth. If we're contemplating the heat element, we can feel the hotness and coldness. But we also have an inner perception of that, like a vision of that. So this is the seeing, yeah? So you both know and see. And in the meditation on these elements, your vision of those elements becomes more clear when you can both know and see each of these elements as they are. So first thing you do is to spend a lot of time, as much time as you need, to be able to really identify each one of these elements and to see that property that that element has, and to be able to see that inside your own body. So take as much time as you need to do that. Do not be in a hurry. Now, if you can do that, even that much is already going to be quite nice, because you're already going to be much more in touch with the feelings inside your own body. So this is already very good. Okay? When you can do that well, you can start to then reflect on the characteristics in anicca, dukkha, anatta. So you can do that by, for example, seeing the impermanence of each one of those, right? How they're changing. Some might change very slowly. Like again, if you're contemplating your teeth in your mouth, then during one meditation, your teeth are not changing very much. So impermanence is slowly. But of course, over the course of your life, your teeth do change quite a lot. So impermanence is there. It's just a bit slower. Something else, like say the wind element, might be changing much more rapidly in your body, and you can feel those different energies and so on. And so you can see impermanence in that way. You can also see, of course, dukkha, right? Because these elements are often uncomfortable. And if you're sitting on a hard seat or something like that, then you can feel that the earth element can be kind of painful. Right? And similarly with the characteristic of not self, then you can see that these elements are not me, they're not mine, they don't belong to me. In a sense, we're just kind of borrowing them for a little while so that we can have our life here on this planet. And so we can see those things inside ourselves. So this is like the next stage in the meditation. First of all, to see what those properties are like, then to contemplate them as impermanent suffering, not self. We can also introduce at that point that internal, external contemplation, right? So you can extend that knowing and seeing perception outside yourself. Again, always begin in meditation with those things that are the most easy and obvious. So, for example, when you want to contemplate the external earth element, start with your chair, right? Start with your seat. You're literally sitting on the earth. So you can feel what that is like. And that's giving you that sensation. Oh, yeah, this earth element in me is contacting that earth element that I'm sitting on. And then we can, through that knowing and seeing, extend that. Same thing with the air, with the water, and so on. So we use our experience, right, our senses and our imagination to be able to get a clear perception of our earth, our water, our air, our fire, and those external, and to be able to see that these are both just the same, and break down the difference between self and other, ajhata, bahidha. And through that process, obviously the purpose of that process is not just to understand these things, right? But the purpose is to let go. When we understand them, then we see that we are part of something which is much greater. We are part of this whole system, this whole network, this whole interrelated flow of these elements, always conditioning each other. Actually, there's another thing I forgot to mention before. When we see these elements individually, right, then another contemplation we can then do is to see the elements in relation to each other, right? So these elements always condition each other. Simple example, you go into a hot place and then the water element appears on your skin, right? That your body, in many ways, is a mechanism for balancing the elements. Yeah. So these are ways in which we can see that these things are always interrelating. In fact, from perspective of Buddhist theory and Buddhist philosophy, all matter, all the physical world has these four elements in one way or another, in a different kind of balance with each other. And so all the matter that we see is some kind of the expression of a dynamic interplay between all of these different elements. So once we realize that this earth in there is just that earth out there, we begin to get a bit less attached to it, maybe a bit more grateful, maybe a bit more humble, maybe a bit less, I'm going to look in the mirror and think, oh, this earth element is looking mighty fine today. And maybe a bit more, it's actually kind of amazing that I have been born here in this world and that these so many conditions have come together, including all of these elements, have come together to allow me to be here and to live, to be happy, to enjoy myself, to have family and friends, and even to practice the Dhamma and to find liberation. This is very, very rare. And if there is one thing that our modern science has taught us, it is that Earth is a lonely place. And it's interesting when you hear about this, that I was hearing somebody just the other day discussing this, saying that, so from a Western perspective, saying we haven't really got used to the idea that Earth is not the center of the universe. And I'm like, buddy, talk to some Buddhists someday. We've understood this for thousands of years. We are not the center of the universe, and that the universe is vast, and most of it is not very nice. Speaking as a someone who was basically brought up on science fiction, including being brought up on the works of Arthur C. Clarke, who of course lived in Colombo. And in fact, side note here, I met Arthur C. Clarke's secretary at a dana in Sydney a little while ago. It was really interesting that she had been like typing up the same books that I had read when I was a kid. And yeah, anyway. And so when I was a kid, you think, oh, space is so amazing. It's so wonderful, so exciting. And now I'm like, space is actually pretty bad. It's like, it's really cold and there's all this radiation, and space is like trying to kill you very, very hard, extremely hard, all the time. And the fact that humans have managed to actually get into space and live there for a period of time is incredible. Truly incredible, really. But it does remind us of how incredibly precious this one little Earth that we have here. So some of you may be fans of Star Trek, and you know that what was his name? Captain Kirk was, I can't remember the name of the actor. Anyway, so he played in science fiction his whole life. When he was in his 90s, he went on a space trip with the Virgin thing. They just go up and then come back down again. I'll remember his name in a minute. And he was like really excited. He'd been like playing at space his whole life. Space, of course, being another one of the elements. And he thought, I'd be so good to go. But when he went up there, it was the most profoundly disturbing experience that he'd ever had. And he looked out of the window and realized that there's just nothing. It's just nothing. It's just blackness. And it's just infinite blackness and cold and death. And when he came back, it was really quite disturbing when he came back, because Jeff Bezos was there to greet. No, it wasn't the Virgin one, it was the other one, Jeff Bezos's one. Jeff Bezos was there, and he was like popping champagne, and there were these girls there, and there was partying and all of these things. And he was had been struck with this incredible existential realization of how harsh space is and how fragile and precious this Earth is. And so I think it's crucial for us, and crucial for us, for our survival as a human civilization. It's crucial for us to enter into a more healthy relationship with the world of nature and with the four elements. And it seems to me that the Buddhist approach of meditation and contemplation and understanding, seeing our own experience as a reflection of that world outside, seeing that we ourselves are merely the same elements, borrowed, organized, shaped. And this can lead us to a relationship of humility and gratitude towards nature, and hopefully lead us to learn how to live our lives in harmony and communion with nature, rather than seeing ourselves as conquerors and exploiters of nature. So anyway, that's a few words for you this evening on the four elements, and I offer that for your reflection.